On June the 3rd, we threw a garden party with 4 guest speakers in the auditorium of Opera Holland Park in West London. Gorgeous cloudless skies above, and the second of these guests was Bob Stanley. You'll know Bob, of course, for over 30 years, a member of St Etienne, writer, a DJ, a regular fixture on these podcasts. He's written 2 wonderful pop histories, Yeah, 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 the story of modern pop, and Let's Do It, the birth of pop, and also compiled a book about the fall with his wife, Tessa Norton. But his latest book is about a group who had to navigate momentous peaks and troughs for over the last 40 years, during which he, and very rightly, thinks they had nowhere near the critical respect they deserve. And this fascinating conversation includes their early life, labelled Teenage Delinquents in Manchester, their start in Australia, success and how they rather unsuccessfully handled it, and how they cooked up the sound of night fever almost by accident. The book's called Bee Gees, The Children of the World, and this applause indicates that Bob is on his way to the stage.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
So, Bob, welcome. That must have been one of the main reasons that you wrote the book. I mean, you loved the Bee Gees when you were young, and felt that they're still, people have to apologise, don't they, for talking about a Bee Gees song?
Yeah. I mean, my introduction to them was my uncle gave me a C90 when I was about 10, I think, of the Beach Boys' greatest hits on one side, like the sort of 1970 compilation, I think it is, and the Best of the Bee Gees on the other, which was the 1969 compilation when they split up temporarily. And he gave it to me like in the year that Jive Talkin came out, so they were kind of back, and I couldn't marry the two at all at the time. It didn't make much sense to me, but I absolutely loved this tape, and I love their harmonies, I love their use of minor chords and orchestration, so from that point on I was a fan. And the Saturday Night Fever stuff, like everybody else at school, it seemed, I had to laugh at them when secretly I thought they were great, and I thought they were amazing songwriters. There he goes again. So it goes back a long way, and they've, as long as I can remember, they've never been taken that seriously. I think I might take this out, actually.
And one of the many revelations of the book is that very early on, of course, they were considered delinquents.
Well, this is it. I wanted to go into this because they obviously they were born and brought up Isle of Man, Manchester, that kind of area, and then went to Australia. Pretty much, I got the impression the local chief of police said, "Get your children out of this area, otherwise they'll spend their lives in jail."
Well, I think it's, comparing to the Rolling Stones, for instance, I think that the image they've always tried to put across is that there's nothing to see here. We're very normal. We write very normal songs, catchy songs for people to hum. That's Barry Gibb's kind of approach. I mean, he's always considered himself the boss of the group, and now he's the only Bee Gee left, so he most definitely is. But when they were kids, Robin used to like setting fire to things. Initially, like just things under his bed. And he thought, well, that worked well. I've gone to billboards and then onto buildings. So Barry and Maurice were both brought home by the police for stealing stuff. And I think when it was like I think it was like a furniture shop went up in South Manchester, and the police came round and said, I really think you should consider moving to Australia because otherwise they're going to all end up in Borstal. So, and at that point, I mean, they were very poor. They used to move, the number of houses they lived in the Isle of Man and Manchester and later Australia, the address changed every 6 months because they just do a bunk before they had to pay the rent. They had no money.
So hard to believe, is it, to tally with your impression of what these guys were like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they definitely gave the impression, that obviously when they got to the late 70s and they were like wearing these outrageous suits and looking very sort of hair in the wind kind of photos, they were giving the impression of looking very wealthy, and by then they were. But I mean, it's like they'd never had money growing up at any point.
And they weren't really educated, were they?
No, because they kept moving. So they never really got a proper education. The twins came out of school when they were 14, and Andy Gibb, who's kind of the Brian Jones character in the Bee Gees story, he was hugely successful in America as a teen idol in the late 70s, and he's basically forgotten now. He died in the mid-80s. But he left school when he was 13. When they were he was living with his parents in Ibiza at that point, and the Bee Gees were in America by then.
They
never
grew
had,
up in showbiz all their lives, didn't they? Which
Yeah.
presumably had no real sense of worldliness or no real understanding of the way often relationships work because they've been in this very closed world.
Yeah,
Would that be
totally. I
fair to
mean,
say?
they never really made friends at school because they were like changing schools so often. So they bonded much more closely, and obviously also tore each other to bits because they were brothers. But yeah, they were like Maurice says, he remembers like playing these, sharing a sort of dressing room with strippers in Australia when he was like 13. So it wasn't a very normal upbringing. No, it was. They never. One of the reasons they were so tight and were so wary of outsiders is because they never really had friends when they were kids because they were just moving all the time.
But they took the enormous gamble. I mean, they were known in Australia. They had hits. It's 60 years ago, pretty much this week since the first record came out. But then, 1967, they decide they're going to come to the UK. Very risky thing to do. And they just wrote to Brian Epstein, is that right?
Yeah, their dad wrote to Brian Epstein. I mean, the thing is, they've been making records since 1963, and none of them had sold. Again, the official thing when they're telling the story themselves is that they'd had like hits in Australia, and they hadn't really. Barry had written some hits for other people, but not. They really weren't. They were just thought of as a child act. They weren't taken seriously, even then. And there was also. Australia was involved in Vietnam, and Barry was about to turn 18, and I think his dad was like, because the boys had been like pestering him to come back to England. He was like, okay, maybe we should go back to England. Wrote to Brian Epstein, as you do, and said, oh, here are my sons. They've written some songs, sent some acetates to NEMS. And Robert Stigwood, who was working at NEMS then, picked them up and thought they were great. So when they got to England, he called them up almost as soon as they arrived. So having gone from like 4 years of having no hits in Australia, putting out a dozen singles, they were meeting the Beatles, meeting Brian Epstein in the studio, recording New York Mining Disaster, all in a matter of like 6 weeks.
I just want to talk about New York Mining Disaster and Massachusetts, which you're going to make quite a bit of this in the book. These were entirely invented events, weren't they?
Yeah.
There was no New York mining disaster in 1941.
No.
But they made a record which kind of sounded folky, didn't it, really?
Yeah, they wrote it when they were in the Polydor studios, which was basically like a demo studio. The first time they'd done anything in Britain. And there was a power cut, and they were like sat at the bottom of this staircase where the studio was, next to this rattly old lift shaft. And they were like, oh, it's like being at the bottom of a mine and being trapped. And so wrote the song in 10 minutes from that, because that's what they did. They were incredibly fast songwriters. And they did like a very basic demo. Then Bill Shepherd, who did all the 60s orchestration, did a proper arrangement for it. But they decided they liked the original sort of sparser version better, and that's the one that came out. But it's an incredibly odd choice of first single.
It's really odd.
Very odd.
I think you and I have talked about this in the past, about the Bee Gees. They are weird, aren't they?
Yeah, they're deeply strange people, yeah.
Massachusetts, you make a point about this, nobody ever feels nostalgic for a state, do they? Massachusetts...
No.
Massachusetts. It's not my hometown, is it?
No. It's no. No, I said it's like they never felt nostalgia for Greater Manchester. It makes as much sense as that.
Like the word, don't they?
Yeah. Well, and quite rightly, and it worked. Yeah. I think New York Mining Disaster 1941. If you saw that title written down in like early 1967, you go, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Yeah. I want to hear that." So they were very savvy like that, and they used language. I mean, a lot of their lyrics are basically gibberish. But they like the sound of the words.
Sense, do they?
No.
But they just had an amazing ear for what sounded good.
Yeah.
The idea that they moved into psychedelia straight away because that's what people wanted to hear. And also into disco, which we should talk about at some stage, actually. But because I think that part of it's so fascinating. They discovered, I think, when they were making Jive Talking, they hit up upon this idea of the falsetto vocal sound. And then when making Night Fever, this extraordinary thing happened involving the drum loop. Tell us that story, because that's the whole invention of a whole new kind of pop music, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, they got convinced to listen to more R&B on the radio, American radio, by Arif Mardin, who produced Jive Talking, and then after that, there was a change in distribution, which sounds like nothing. Like Polydor got a different distributor, but it meant they couldn't work with Arif Mardin anymore, and they were like panicking. And or even more, and said, "You can do it yourselves. Just try and produce yourselves." So they did, and it worked. And they were in a chateau in the south of France, a bit like the Stones again. The Honky Chateau, Elton John's Honky Chateau, and everything was falling to bits. The studio was a mess, and then the drummer, his mum got ill, and he had to fly home. And they were like, "Well, what on earth are we going to do now? We're in a studio where like nothing really works, and we've got no drummer." So they had to make loops out of the drum tracks he'd already done. One for Night Fever, and they looped it, and that's the drums on Staying Alive. They just used it as like a sample, really, I suppose, thinking they'd replace it when the drummer got back.
And then just realised it worked.
No, they sounded perfect, so why alter it? And from that point on, up until like the mid-'80s, their productions got...
The drummers were then unemployed, it's right? Like,
yeah.
Mass redundancy.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the different personalities in the group. So Barry, for a start, he's the older brother. He's the leader. He's obsessed with I'm fascinated by this because I think pop music is all about facial hair, and he's obsessed with his beard, isn't he?
He is, yeah. In the mid-'80s,
to a strange extent.
Yeah, he did a film. He did a solo album and a film to go with it, which is quite ahead of the time, called Now Voyager in the mid-'80s, and it's quite amusing. It's all right. It's not terrible, but he shaved off his beard. He just thought, "No, I've had the beard long enough now. It's the mid-'80s. People don't have beards in the mid-'80s," and he hated the way he looked. He does look quite strange because you've got used to the way he looks.
He's a bearded concept, isn't he?
Effectively.
Yeah.
Work without a beard.
But of course, in the '60s, he didn't have a beard. It's like when he was like a sort of pin-up in the '60s.
No,
just no beard. But I think it just made him feel more confident and. So he grew his beard back straight away. There's one brief period in the mid-'80s he's got no beard.
But then there's Robin. I think you describe in the book, you say he's got a kind of Chatterton side to him. Explain that.
Well, he was always getting ill. I think it's like their kind of drugs of choice were like, Maurice was an alcoholic, basically. Barry smoked a lot. And Robin took uppers and downers, and I think the uppers and downers were...
We've ticked every box there. We've been right through the menu.
Yeah, Pilly, Potty and Boozy, they used to call each other.
That's right.
Robin was like the one who sort of suffered the most early on with this and would like collapse a lot, and they couldn't like rouse him to do a show sometimes. So he was very, very thin. So that's why I was thinking he's like a Chatterton kind of character in the group. And to sort of emphasise this, he started wearing kind of like frock coats or whatever when he did his solo stuff in 1969, 1970. The songs are all about Victorian era, First World War. Yes. Everything's set in the past. It's really, really odd and really quite beautiful stuff. It's just him playing like a harmonium with a drum machine. He got a drum machine. He said he bought in Soho. It sounds like one from like an old home organ. It's a bit like that. And made 2 albums like that and had a massive hit with Saved by the Bell, which I think is the first hit to have a drum machine on it. I can't think of any earlier one. So you've got massive orchestration with a drum machine. It's the oddest sound with these very odd lyrics about the First World War.
So Maurice, you've said, was an alcoholic, and he had the misfortune to move in next door to who?
Ringo.
We're really not the influence he was would have held. This is kind of late 60s, isn't it? Because the other thing that amazed me that came through in the book is how young they all got married.
Yeah, I think they're all teenagers when they got married. Again, it's funny. I think of the Stones, where like Mick and Brian both married people who looked exactly like them. But Maurice married Lulu, so there's quite a big difference there. Lulu, poor Maurice, feel sorry for him. Like Lulu, when she announced to her mum that she was getting married to the good-looking one from the Bee Gees, her mum assumed she meant Barry. I was very disappointed when it was Maurice.
That whole period is extraordinary in your book, because there's a bit where they're only 18, I think, the twins, and there's a bit where they're in a club in London and they meet John Lennon. And one of them buys him a drink. When he opens his wallet, he sees his Beatles fan club card inside it, And I think, I can't remember which one, it might have been Maurice, bought 6 Rolls Royces because he just didn't know what to do with the money. I mean, how did they cope with all that? It was extraordinary because it happened so fast, didn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, they didn't really because the whole thing imploded within 2 years. There was like just a jealousy between Barry and Robin, both thinking they were like the lead singer. And at that point, Robin had probably done lead vocals on more of the hits like Massachusetts than Barry had. But Robert Stigwood always thought Barry was the leader of the group and should be the lead singer and the front man, which he obviously became in the 70s. So they didn't cope with it very well at all. And but again, Robin was in the Hither Green train crash, which was, at the time was one of the worst train disasters in Britain. And he was in on the train and climbed out, and he was injured but not too badly. But it's like. And then 2 days later, they were like playing at a festival in Holland or something. It's like there was there was nothing back then, no kind of counselling, no time to relax. And I think from that point on, the brothers would say, "Yeah, Robin's a bit strange. He's a bit weird." And it's like, well, I'm sure he's got like depression and like post-traumatic
stress disorder.
Yes, almost certainly. You're pulling the injured and dead bodies out of a train. It's not going to be the best thing that could happen to you. So, it's that period. Everything's very, very condensed. Their like, initial fame is condensed into about 18 months after like years and years of struggling in Australia, doing like the equivalent of working men's clubs, like servicemen's clubs in Australia, and playing after the stripper or before the stripper, and doing Mild Man's a Dustman and Puff the Magic Dragon. As well as their own songs. Wasn't the most. Everything happened very quickly, and they didn't really cope with it that well.
I've got a theory. I've got loads of theories, but I got a theory about pop music that you can look at all acts in terms of on two axes, if you like. One is charisma, and the other is talent. And some groups have loads of charisma, and some groups have loads of talent. And it strikes me that the Bee Gees have 95% talent and 5% charisma. Am I missing something?
No, I think that's probably fair enough. They're never very good in.
This man wrote a book about them.
I wouldn't say they're very charismatic. I mean, I think Maurice is probably the most charismatic out of the three, and he was always the one who was like never did interviews, or was like the man in the middle, and the other two were the singers. So, but they're obviously incredibly talented. I mean, I've always admired people who like work at their craft and then write great songs and can do great arrangements, become great musicians. I'm not a huge believer in kind of the myth that it all just comes to you naturally and you're a born genius, unless you're Brian Wilson or someone. There's very few people I think like that. And the Bee Gees are a very good example. It's like working away, working really hard.
Which you can see, because even Brian Wilson only had one golden era, whereas the Bee Gees had a few, didn't they?
Oh yeah. I mean that's the most extraordinary thing I think, is that like Maurice died in 2003, and up until that point, it was still having top 20 hits and being on top of the pops in Britain, like whenever they put a new record out.
We must ask you about the Take That. Probably a popular story. It's really interesting, but when Take That had a big hit with Back for Good, the inside story was that Back for Good, which was apparently a Take That composition, was actually written by the Bee Gees on the understanding that if they released it, they must do How Deep Is Your Love by the Bee Gees as the follow-up single, because they knew that Back for Good was going to be so huge that the following single would sell really well. Is that true? Do you think?
No. It's quite
what a
peculiar.
shame.
I remember hearing that.
We want it to be true.
Everybody heard that at the time, and it's kind of made sense. It's like, the chorus sounds like it's written by Barry Gibb. You can imagine the Gibbs doing the backing vocals on the chorus and everything. And no, I mean the guy who wrote Back for Good, his name's on the credit. He's not in Take That. It's like some Denmark Street songwriter.
No.
It's funny, isn't it? It's like in the internet age that would never have happened. That like urban myth, but it kind of made sense.
I desperately want it to be true.
I'd love it to be true. I'd love the Bee Gees to have written Back for Good. It's a great song, but no, sadly not.
So was there ever a time? I can't remember now what the press made of them back in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, because no one had any real understanding of their personalities. There didn't appear to be a great story there either, a great kind of narrative like there was with the Stones or the Beatles or whatever. So were they always kind of, dare I use the word, uncool? Is that fair to say?
I think again in the late 60s, I think they were like taken much more seriously.
Yeah.
And people would talk about like Peter Gabriel said, the first Genesis record, they were just mimicking the Bee Gees because that was the sound that was like doing well at the time in early '68. And then Jonathan King would like that when he signed them. Space Oddity is remarkably similar to New York Mining Disaster, I think. And the Mellotron, obviously they were all over the Mellotron ahead of King Crimson and Yes and everyone. And all these things sound a little bit odd when you say it out loud. So no, surely not the Bee Gees. But no, they were.
They don't get nearly enough credit for that.
No. So that's the period. And then again, I think the mid to late 70s stuff, when the kind of the disco sucks thing happened and disco's replaced by bands like Toto and Foreigner and REO Speedwagon, the productions on those records are remarkably similar to the mid-70s Bee Gees. So, they haven't got the falsetto voices, that's the main difference, but productions are very similar, kind of blue-eyed soul, especially Foreigner, I suppose.
But there is, I can feel a kind of change in the attitude towards them. Diana Ross and Michael Jackson, and then the Pet Shop Boys. I remember talking about all their arrangements were based on the Bee Gees. Noel Gallagher, a huge fan.
Yeah.
So, do you feel that there is more of a kind of understanding of how incredibly important they were?
I'd like to say there is, but I'm not actually that sure. It felt like 20 years ago, there was covers of the Bee Gees songs in the chart constantly, and that was like around the time that Noel Gallagher was like singing their praises, and like Steps did 2 Bee Gees covers and had massive hits, and like More Than a Woman. All these things were covered and became hits for boy bands and X Factor kind of singers as well. And at that point, they got their sort of Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Brits and all these things. But I think since Maurice died and the group effectively ceased to exist, like Barry's had his legend spot at Glastonbury, but you go out and try and find the deluxe edition of Main Course. Well, there isn't one. They haven't looked after their catalogue at all, and I think it shows how important it is to do that. You look at ABBA with Voyage, and they've managed it all very, very well.
You've got to work on it, haven't you?
You have to work on it.
Your own,
completely. Well, there were things in your book that I never knew, and I thought was absolutely riveting. And indeed, there are copies of it over here, which Bob would be very happy to sign, I think.
Yes, I would.
And thanks so much, Bob. We're going to take a break now. Bob Stanley.
Thank you. Cheers.
It's terrific.
Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.